I was going to kick it off with a question to start to both of you, and we've got roving mics for anyone that wants to make a comment or ask a question. Andrew, you went out on a bit of a limb there with some quite, you provided a lot of candour in your advice. And I just thought I'd be fair to put it in a bit of context, because you're not the Lone Ranger on this. I don't mean to dob Gary in again, but Gary's previously said that while FOI laws are well motivated, they've now reached the point where they strike at the heart of the public servant's need for confidentiality and providing frank advice to government. Terry Moran has made a similar comment. Ken Henry said that because of FOI, records are not always kept, and it is very important that records are kept of oral communication, not just for records, but for future use. Paul Barrett referred to it as the great oral culture in Australia, and it's actually an international issue where the Swedish Auditor General actually talked about the empty archives. How much of this is, given that we heard a very different model, and I'm not as familiar with it, from Paula Bennett this morning about New Zealand putting cabinet papers up 3 weeks afterwards, which is unimaginable in Australia. I mean, it's not something that I'm aware has been contemplated. How much of this is something that we just need to suck up effectively and understand that is the price of decision making, or is it something that we could try to draw lines around? Sulette talked about the importance of data, and citizens now have a greater capacity to analyse that. There are more tools out there. Appreciate there's an inequality in that, but versus analysis or advice. And without mentioning names, and I should clarify, I hadn't met Andrew until yesterday. We've never served in the same department. How much of this is something that political leaders need to respond to? Because there's also an immediacy of decision making that's required by the media now. And finally, how much of this is due to that immediacy required of political leaders and public servants for immediate advice, quick decisions, versus the exposure of those decisions? And I think sometimes the two can get conflated.
There's a lot in that question, Scott, but I stand by what I said. Overwhelmingly, I think very few people have got an issue with disclosure of data, and I'm sure that one of the key themes of this conference is how can we actually take that data in a de-identified way and use it for good purposes. We saw the New Zealand Minister this morning talking about data-driven policy analysis and using actuarial information to inform decision making. Very few people have got an issue about individual records being available to that individual, although of course there have been some significant cases where there may be material in relation to that individual which is derived in relation to intelligence or law enforcement or other issues, and you can have a healthy debate there. The principal thesis I had though was that, like it or not, we are living in a real world where the behaviour of many ministers and different governments is that they do not wish a written record which exposes multiple options or recommendations from a department to become a public document. Now, I've certainly seen the experience where some don't care, where they say, I'm not interested in having a debate with the media or journalists, just put it out there. I think that probably requires a confident and strong minister to be of that position, someone who basically says, I'll just get out there and talk about the decision. The fact that I took a position different to departmental advice is simply part of the process, and I'm happy to explain and defend that. But I think that, and I've certainly seen other ministers who don't want to get caught up in the debate that inevitably occurs in the media cycle, that they went against departmental advice or whatever it happens to be. And that, I think, is the thing that then results in the sorts of behaviours that we've seen. I'd be fascinated, I would be absolutely fascinated to see whether the publication of cabinet materials a few weeks after, or the publication of deliberative documents soon after they've been provided, means that we're really seeing the real documents in what they should be in a robust way, or whether the whole system gets blanded down as a result. So ultimately, it's a question, I think, for reality. The reality is that the media are interested, and opposition parties, and indeed some government backbenchers are interested in the story behind the decision to try and get the colour and movement about who said what to who, and that is having the impact ultimately of many ministers in both the governments that I've served in, both major political parties. Many ministers saying, I don't want that on the record. And it throws up enormous conflicts for senior public servants about when material should properly be placed on the record, because it is potentially the issue where key issues are going to be decided or where key actions are going to be taken. So, Senator, I think that the issue is almost a very real issue for our politicians as to can they believe that they can continue to operate effectively in an era of greater disclosure, or do they ultimately believe that the candour that's been accorded and the protection that's been accorded to cabinet deliberations should in fact be extended somewhat to pick up a broader class of deliberations, because in my view, if that doesn't happen, we'll actually get worse policy outcomes and history will be the poorer for it. So
do you have anything to add? You come from a very different starting point.
I do, as you probably guessed. A couple of things. De-identified data is useful, and the open data movement is fantastic. It is not a replacement for FOI. And the reason it's not a replacement is because A, it simply won't address the individual injustices that I mentioned, but B, because it doesn't actually enforce individual accountability. And individual accountability is what people increasingly want. That's what the electorate wants. And you can't get trust back with the electorate without having that. I think one of the big issues that trust that people have had with politicians in Australia in the last few years is that there hasn't been a sense of accountability for their actions. There's been promises and broken promises from both sides of politics. I'm not playing one side or the other here. But not surprisingly, the electorate's a bit dubious about the credibility of their politicians as a result of it. The irony, I think, for people potentially in the civil service who have reluctance about FOI is that rather than seeing it as a threat, I think that it's potentially a savior. Because if you give good advice, it is frank and fearless, but it's based on good evidence, rational, and it is reasonably in step with the values that are held by broader society, then I think that if ministers choose to go a different path, it's not the public servant who should be blamed for this. It's a politician who will have to stand out there and explain why they've taken a different path. Now, they may have a very good reason for doing it, but part of being elected as a public official is fronting up and explaining what those reasons are, and that's part of their role.
Any comments, questions from the floor? We've got about 10 or 15 minutes.
Oh dear, we've sent you all into silence of shock.
No, I've done a number of Senate inquiries into FY. It had the same impact on the audience. Well, is there anyone here? Oh, Gary. Can't quite see everyone from up here with the lights.
Just Gary Banks. Just, I guess one question to Suelette. The survey you referred to by the Edelman Australia, I quickly Googled them, and they're a PR firm. We had a reference earlier to a survey by the Monash, the Social Inclusion Survey, which I've looked into, including its methodology, and they have a sample of 6,000, and it's found an actual a slight improvement from a very low base in the degree of trust in government. But I just thought you might want to comment on the Edelman.
I'm not saying that they're the best survey, although they do traditionally run a survey across, I think it's 27 or 30 countries. It's maybe 20 plus thousand people are actually surveyed. So they get, one thing that is advantageous about their stuff is they compare it to the other countries in your region. And that's one thing that was of particular interest to me. But I'm not saying that they're the best surveys. I don't think though that the general trend would be disputed in that there is a kind of all-time low level of trust for government happening among the electorate. Maybe not all of time, but it's certainly not where it was some years ago. And that is a trend that has been borne out, I think, by other research as well. It certainly exists. I think in the US there was one statistic I saw where Congress had like a 16% approval rating or something quite astonishing. So it is a bigger trend. And the question is, can things like FOI, used in an invigorated way, not pushed aside as a pariah, as that, smelly guy with bad breath in the corner, that it's kind of, perhaps been traded a bit in the last few years as being how can we, make it more expensive to access, or how can we push that guy in the corner, but rather embraced and brought back in, be used as a tool to reinvigorate that trust relationship. I mean, that's why it was brought in the first place. You can trust what we're doing because you can look at what we're doing. And that is a very fundamental element of trust. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that there is research to show that increasingly young people trust networks that are close networks, so personal network, Facebook, your friend, my friend, your friend of my friend, that sort of thing. And what's interesting about FOI is that's at a very micro scale. A lot of FOI is also done at a very micro scale. It is about the individual pursuing their own particular case. I'm putting aside the larger public interest ones for a minute. But I think that that's interesting in that it's potentially something that matches how people want to trust increasingly, that micro engagement with government, my single user record in government, rather than the metadata you were talking about. So that to me seems another good reason why, with a bit of a spruce up, a spit and polish, maybe FOI can be one of the tools that are used to re-engage.
Andrew, this might provoke we've got a question up there, up the back.
Just while our question's coming, I might just say that I suspect our positions are actually not very far apart. My proposition is quite specific to a particular element of government activity. And we're of course seeing, and we've seen discussions here today about many different ways of government interacting with people and engaging more broadly than just with interest groups into citizens more generally. That's a very positive development. The sorts of processes that we see of government genuinely issuing discussion papers, seeking views, having draft policies, having final policies, the old green paper, white paper processes of yesterday are used extensively as a way to ensure that there is a broad canvassing of ideas. But it comes back to the point that I'm making, that we are seeing behaviour that is obviously being driven because people are concerned that conflict or perceived conflict at the centre of government is more newsworthy than the actual decision itself. Imagine the approach I had to take in 2007 in writing the incoming government brief for the incoming Labor government as to our candid views in relation to their policies in relation to asylum seekers. And whether or not dismantling the Pacific strategy and undertaking various other actions would in fact be a good public policy development or whatever. I found ways to ensure that that was not provided in a way that would be disclosable. I simply referred in the incoming government brief that these were serious matters that would require cabinet consideration, that Minister will brief you and your cabinet colleagues in due course. That was the way, because otherwise there would have been disclosure of advice that may well have been not thanked by the Minister of the day. It's pretty clear what he would have thought. And those are the real issues that people have to face up with. People in this room are facing up to that sort of issue, and workarounds are occurring. Things aren't being written down, and ultimately the policy process is being devalued. So my proposition is that returning the ability to ensure that there's confidence in the most significant aspects of government, I don't think weakens any of those aspects about individuals' abilities to understand their own rights or entitlements or whatever it happens to be, but the greater public good is restoring confidence in a good policy process as opposed to this fear of disclosure, which weakens the policy process.
I'm just going to ask a very quick follow-up of you, Andrew. You mentioned you've got experience across a number of agencies. It appears to me, having been in Parliament for 7 years, that different agencies, the FOI applies quite differently to their operation. So in the preparation of budgets, because they're all going to cabinet committees, they're effectively exempt. You've been involved in issues that would involve national security, which also have great, but areas such as my current portfolio, unless it's budget related, are not, and that I make no complaint about that, but does that pose an issue where just because of what's exempt and what's not, and the nature of work some departments do, particularly central agencies and national security, that the application of FOI across departments leads to very different behaviours in different departments?
Yes, it does, and I think there's different levels of maturity and experience as a result. And so for some agencies, frankly, it is simpler because, frankly, they're operating in a cabinet in confidence environment or a law enforcement or national security environment. For those departments, though, that are operating outside that, aspect of deliberative material is obviously something that some ministers don't care, but many ministers do care, and it alters behaviours as a result.
Gentleman up the back.
Craig Farrell, Department of Immigration and Border Protection. Hello, Andrew. Thanks very much. That's a very interesting debate. I wanted to take it right down to an individual personal level, not for myself, but for an individual decision maker that then has their name and potentially other personal details revealed as a result of an FOI decision. Now, so a case in point, if I just use the immigration context, it might be something to do with a visa cancellation, for argument's sake. Now, my personal view is I don't see the public interest in releasing the name of the decision maker as opposed to releasing the fact that this is an authorised delegate to make this decision. I'm also seeing a groundswell, not just in my portfolio, where decision makers now are a little gun shy to make a decision because their information might be revealed. Sometimes that might be to do with a perceived or real threat. Where there's a real threat, there's an ability to, recant information, redact information. But in the current environment, what I'm seeing is that people don't know what threat might be down the road. So therefore, they're becoming quite gun-shy at putting themselves forward as decision makers. I'm now also seeing that bleed out into the FOI decision-making context. So I'm not sure if I've got my question across there. I'm interested in your views on what can be perceived to be a personal threat and the impact that that might have.
I'm happy to have a go at that. Craig and I used to work together, and this is a very real issue, not only for his department, but more generally. And look, there's a fascinating sort of coincidence of legal obligations here, whereas an employer, departments have a responsibility under workplace health and safety to provide a safe working environment, and yet in environments where employees may be the subject of threats or actual violence, disclosure of their identity becomes a real issue. It's no accident that policemen have a number, or policewomen have a number, not a name, on their badge. I would have thought the answer is that there really does need to be a mature risk assessment in relation to that type of decision or that particular decision, and ultimately a view that if there would be a risk, that there is some way to not disclose the name of the officer, but to in some other way ensure that there's a record of who made the decision. But the countervailing point, and this is an interesting debate, is that humanising the decision and making it clear that it's a person who's made the decision, and that often helps explain the decision better. And a lot of this is about explaining the reasons why. Now we know that some people may take that very badly, particularly if they're serious decisions to say, order their deportation. I've personally been the subject of numerous death threats from people who had significant criminal records, who were not Australian citizens and who were being deported. And you always wonder whether they may do something about it at an individual level. But Craig, a serious series of issues, and just one minute aspect of, I think, how FOI operates in practice. So.
We had a quick response.
Thank you. Just what I'm experiencing now is that, Andrew, as you point out, where there's an individual and there's a known threat, then we redact. That's quite straightforward. But the sense I'm getting now is that I'm not to know what's going to happen in the future, therefore I won't make a decision. It's that aspect. It's quite difficult to get to the bottom of.
Yep.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously have to keep your employees safe, but generally speaking, I think transparency is a better route to take. But I'm actually less concerned about the transparency of the name of the decision maker, although I do think that that is important for justice both being done and being seen to be done in a decision-making process, so much as all of the material on which the decision was made needs to be made transparent. So I had very grave concerns about the idea of people getting, adverse ASIO evaluations and not being able to know any aspect of where they came from. What is this data? How solid is it? Do we know that it has integrity? You can't know that. And the veil of secrecy around that, to me, is really quite heinous. It is, to me, in a sense, it's a star chamber. It's a darkness at noon scenario. And while I can understand there's a need for security, I think there's also a need for some form of natural justice, and in a sense that outweighs it in that scenario. So I think in terms of protecting employees' names, I can see an absolute validity to what you're saying. I'd be much more concerned with the underlying facts, and I wonder that people, putting aside the slightly mad or the slightly bad, I wonder that people might be less inclined to take a personally aggressive approach to the person who made the decision if they could actually have truth and transparency about all of the material on which the decision was made, so that if any of it is inaccurate, they can refute that.
Yeah, the only thing I must add is that, having been aware of some of these issues from our level, is that sometimes that aim actually conflicts with the very aim that was mentioned there. And this is one of those difficult elements that Andrew's probably had more experience with than most, which is that in order to protect a staff member or a source, then the reveal would actually pose the very risk. We've got time for one last question down the front here.
Thanks. Dominique McCoy from the Metropolitan Cemeteries Board in Western Australia, so I've got a pretty unique set of records. Sue, I could see the passion with which you spoke about the FOI has the capacity to address injustices. If an injustice has occurred, like the Apache or something's happened, and I can very much value and appreciate that. But I suppose on the flip side, what's your thoughts about when we do release information under FOI, and say I release something that's 1,000 words of FOI information, and then whether it's the media or somebody else just takes, 150 of those words, re-releases it, rebadges it, issues it out, completely out of context, and that can actually cause an equivalent amount of injustice or pain or suffering. And when it gets out there and we've all stood there and just watched as it's run, and of course everybody knows that once it's on Facebook it must be true. What's your opinion on when we don't have control of once the information is released, and then how it's used and the dangers that can then pose?
So I guess the hard part is this. Yes, there are bad media, and there are media who do things like, leave out words like not. No, there were no people accounted for. And we obviously object to those things, they're wrong. But, a lot of people die from knife wounds every year. We still sell steak knives because they're used for a lot of other reasons, like eating a good steak. So you actually, I think that in the trade-off game, although the media is unfair sometimes, you've got to, just in a free and open democratic society, go with the flow on the transparency. Now, there are ways to respond to it, and the great thing about a much more fragmented, flat media surface, which we have today, is that it gives the opportunity, I think, for people in government, potentially with approval of whoever needs to be gotten, comms or whatever, to respond, whether it's in a Twitter forum through your comms people, or whether it's Facebook or whatever, to inaccurate information. And if you tell it like it is rather than telling it like spin, people will actually listen to it. I'm not saying that you'll get to everybody, but it is worth doing that. And there are also lots of online blog specialist areas. So if you're in a specialist area like cemeteries, it's quite possible that the people who are, I was going to say your natural constituency, but possibly that's not the right terminology, but people who might be of interest in your area might have now a whole set of specialist online blogs that they turn to. And if you go to that, you'll be able to reach that community far more effectively. Now, obviously, if the article's been in the SMH, it's a bit harder to reach that same audience. And I can't defend bad journalists because there is no defense for them. Hopefully one day there will be justice in another lifetime for them.
Well, look, on that note, because we have run a little bit over time, thank you, Andrew, thank you, Sue Lett, for your time, and thanks everyone for their contributions.